For an aircraft that was produced in relatively small numbers, the Yakovlev Yak-2 has a surprisingly complex history. Unfortunately, not a huge number of photos exist of this aircraft, and instead of repeating the same photo several times throughout the video, I'm going to include some footage of the Yak-2 as it appears in the game War Thunder. Hopefully it isn't too jarring of a change and you will still enjoy the video. By the late 1930s, Alexander Yakovlev had become one of the best-known aircraft designers in the Soviet Union, but his fame came from the development of sporting and trainer aircraft. He was an ambitious man, and he wanted to turn his attention to the development of military aircraft, but there was just one problem with his plan: Stalin. During this time, a lot of the major decisions on which Soviet weapons were adopted were personally made by Stalin. For various reasons that usually included words like gulag or firing squad, it was not advisable to go against Stalin's wishes, and when it came to aircraft design, his main desire was speed. Yakovlev was aware of this, and with his experience of building racing aircraft, he was confident in his endeavours. If he could produce a fast aircraft, provided it looked like a practical warplane and was at least nominally intended to fly military missions, not only would it go into mass production, but he himself would get into Stalin's good favour. And so Yakovlev began designing his brand new fast aircraft. And this is where I enter some uncertain ground when it comes to facts and source material. Many sources conflict with another on at least one point when it comes to the design and development of the Yak-2 prototype itself. Now, after consulting with a friend who knows a bit more about these things than I do, I've decided to go with the two main sources that are in the video description below. However, if anyone out there has any other sources they can recommend for Soviet aircraft development, please feel free to let me know in a comment. Now, the prototype. Yakovlev went with a twin-engine, low-wing monoplane design. It was of a mixed construction, with a twin tail, fully retractable hydraulically powered landing gear, and fully enclosed cockpits for a pilot in the nose and a navigator behind the wing. The wing was made entirely of wood, comprising of box spars and double-sided ribs, and it was covered in a ply skin. The streamlined fuselage was a mix of wood and metal, with the nose and rear fuselage built on welded steel tubing, and the central section being made entirely of wood. This central section was made integral with the wing, and was also skinned with plywood. The rear fuselage was based on a truss of welded steel tube bracing, which was covered in fabric, and the whole arrangement was attached to the central fuselage by 14 removable bolts. The control surfaces were made from a mix of duraluminum, wood, and fabric. The ailerons were operated by push-pull tubes and had no control tabs, and the available trailing edge inboard and outboard of the engines were occupied by all-metal split flaps. These were hydraulically operated and could be depressed down to a maximum angle of 55 degrees. In the tail, the elevators and rudder were a mix of metal and fabric again, and were driven by cables. Interestingly, the tailplane had all-metal skin, fins, and ribs, but the two main spars were wood. Not too sure what the exact reason for that was, but there you go. To power this streamlined package, Yakovlev chose the Klimov M103 liquid-cooled V12 engine. These provided a takeoff power of 960 horsepower each, and drove a 3-blade variable pitch propeller. The fuel was kept in 4 tanks that were housed inboard and outboard of the engines, and 2 more tanks that were in the centre of the fuselage, giving a total fuel capacity of 1,232 litres. This aircraft would come to be known as the YA-22, or simply the aircraft number 22. When completed, it featured no military equipment, and this was because Yakovlev's aim was to build the fastest aircraft possible that looked capable of flying military missions, rather than being designed with a specific role in mind. Now, this is one of those statements in which the source material conflicts, so just bear that in mind. Supposedly, Yakovlev chose to label it as a reconnaissance aircraft. The intention, and I say intention, was to have a 7.62mm machine gun in the nose, and another to be mounted aft and operated by the navigator. Along with this, provision was to be made for space in the fuselage to hold camera equipment and a small armament of light bombs. But all of this was hypothetical and never done, and so the aircraft was delivered unarmed and unequipped for any kind of military duty. This would cause problems down the line. When it arrived in Moscow, the prototype caught a lot of attention. It looked promisingly agile for a twin-engine aircraft. It had a length of 9.34 meters, a wingspan of 14 meters. It had an empty weight of 3,700 kilograms approximately, and a maximum loaded weight of 5,100 kilograms. Its range of 1,000 kilometers was a bit mediocre, but its speed was very impressive, being able to achieve 567 kilometers an hour at an altitude of 4,900 meters. It took off for the first time from the Moscow Central Aerodrome in early February of 1939. Its handling was praised by the pilot, and news of the aircraft soon reached Stalin, who allowed it to be flown in the May Day flyover. Though in its current unarmed state, the prototype was little more than a high-powered racing aircraft, totally incapable of flying any military mission, it so impressed Stalin that the General Secretary called for it to be modified as a fast bomber and put into immediate production as the BB-22. It was then sent to the VVS for state testing, and this promptly put their test pilots and engineers into a bit of an awkward situation. Stalin had little interest in the actual details of aircraft design, but he considered this new plane to be the best thing in the sky, and it was difficult for test staff to explain to him that to turn the aircraft into a useful plane for the Air Force, they would have to redesign almost all of it. The high performance had been achieved by making a streamlined and beautiful aircraft, something that could not be achieved in a militarized version that would have guns, bomb racks, radio equipment, and defensive armor bolted onto it. The aircraft would also be highly impractical to transport due to the wing being made in one piece, which made it impossible to move by rail. Following further tests, it was also found that the aircraft's original climb rate had been misrepresented. The time to climb to 7,000 meters had been given as 8.7 minutes, but in practice it was 33 minutes, as the engines were always overheating and the aircraft had to repeatedly level out to let them cool. The VVS quickly recognized that the 22 was not a military machine. However, on the 20th of June 1939, Resolution 171 was passed, ordering it into production anyway. Now, at the same time as this, Vladimir Petlyakov had created his aircraft number 100, which was a predecessor to the PE-2. Now, this met the same requirements without the myriad of problems faced by Yakovlev's design. The key factor in this situation was Stalin's approval of Yakovlev, who, unlike his rival, wasn't sitting in an NKVD prison cell. In May, Yakovlev's team built a mock-up of the BB-22, and in June the VVS Commission made its initial report. It called for the BB-22 to carry a bomb load of 400 to 700 kilograms and have a rear defensive gun. It also asked Yakovlev to rectify 72 listed defects on the original design, and to present the modified aircraft for state trials on the 1st of August that year. Yakovlev addressed some of the more serious of these defects, but most of them he ignored and never actually resubmitted the prototype. Instead, he just had 3,300 of the original drawings photocopied to speed things along, and the aircraft went into production in September. The first production version retained most of the original airframe, with the exception of a redesigned central fuselage that incorporated a bomb bay to carry 4 large bombs or several smaller ones. A fixed machine gun was installed in the nose, and the navigator was given a similar gun in a pivoting mount. Other modifications also included some repeated revisions of the engine cooling systems and the fitting of new propellers to increase its climb performance. The first aircraft rolled out from Factory Number 1 on New Year's Eve 1939, but arguments over the build standard delayed the first flight until the 20th of February. Having realized that Yakovlev had deceived them, VVS staff repeatedly demanded that the defects listed in their report should still be corrected. However, factory staff building the aircraft were following Yakovlev's instructions and built the planes to the design he submitted. That same month, the Commission then recommended that the original production order of 50 aircraft be limited to 10 examples, all of which were delivered for testing by mid-February. Around this time, the service designation was changed from BB-22 to Yak-2 under a new scheme to honour aircraft designers. Further changes were now made to the design, the biggest being yet another redesign of the central fuselage. Now, the navigator was moved right behind the pilot, and the bomb bay was now behind the rear spar. The main advantage of this change was that the rear canopy could be raised up on a hydraulic jack that could offer the navigator's gun a better field of fire than before. All manner of problems continued to plague the Yak-2 during its production. A VVS report bluntly stated that Yak-2s built at Factory No. 1 were deemed unsatisfactory. There were problems with the engines overheating and maintaining power, there were instances of tail flutter, unreliability of the hydraulic systems, and most worrying was the tendency for the bolts securing the engines to fracture and break. The final VVS report showed that not only had performance sharply deteriorated, but the number of uncorrected faults had grown to 183, and calls began to grow for production to be stopped. After a VVS test pilot spoke out publicly about the problems, a particularly brave thing to do at the time, Stalin ordered an investigation. Yakovlev promptly shifted all blame onto Factory No. 1, and production was transferred over to Factory No. 81. The director of the factory tried to offload responsibility of the existing Yaks to the VVS, but to no avail. A factory one batch of 25 Yak-2s were supposedly so defective that they were actually unflyable. Factory 81 did its best to rectify the more obvious problems, and overall quality did improve, but the Yaks never reached a standard acceptable to the VVS despite production reaching over 100 units at this time. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, many of the Yaks were destroyed on the ground, which, considering their history, was probably for the best, and there was one unfortunate incident of friendly fire when an I-15 shot down a Yak-2, the aircraft being a somewhat uncommon sight in the sky itself. The aircraft's biggest contribution would be to serve as an example of how political favoritism can breed disaster in the world of aircraft design itself. Aside from the main production versions, two other prototypes were also explored. The R-12 was a reconnaissance version of the Yak-2 and had been included in the original 1939 design program. A single model was built and completed in June 1940, but Yakovlev didn't submit the aircraft for state testing due to the growing list of problems with the other models. An added problem was that the poor design of the wire antenna limited the radio to only half of its wave bands. The Yak-2 cab, which is the model featured in War Thunder, was a prototype ground attack aircraft fitted with the CAV MV gun and bombing installation. This comprised of a ventral cannon pack and a special glazed nose for the bomb aiming equipment. Few details of this particular aircraft model survive, as all prototype work was halted after the German invasion. Attempts to rectify the faults of the Yak-2 would lead to the development of the Yak-4, also known as the B-22 Biz. The main difference was the installation of M105 engines, each rated at 1050 horsepower. The rear fuselage was redesigned and lengthened, and various improvements were made to the engine mountings, cooling, and fuel systems. It replaced the Yak-2 in production in November of 1940. Total production of the Yak-4 was about 100 units, bringing the total number of the series aircraft up to 201. The final 22 aircraft were delivered in April of 1941, but crews hardly had time to convert to the new planes before the war kicked off in June. Attrition was high, mainly due to enemy attacks on airfields and teething problems with the new planes themselves, and so, despite what appeared to be a promising start in 1939, Yakovlev's first foray into combat aircraft was anything but smooth. He would, of course, go on to redeem himself with other designs during the war, but that's a story for another day.